Welcome. This video refers to a recent announcement by Rishi Sunak in regards to, and I'm quoting here from Her Majesty's own government website, UK and Singapore agree landmark financial partnership for the financial services industry. Now, this indeed would be great news and would seriously help soothe the frayed nerves of the great financial leaders in the City of London. These guys and girls, well, they've been under a pretty fierce amount of pressure and they've been faced by colleagues and subordinates along with other participants in the industry with what-if questions. For months, haven't been unable to provide clear answers because Westminster hasn't been able to provide the right information. Now, let's not be under any illusion. The services industry is by far the main contributor to the exchequer, and they feel like they've been ignored. But now they are more hopeful. Why? Because they have one of their own in the right job for them at the right time. Rishi Sunak's pedigree can hardly be matched by any other cabinet member in Westminster. He has a vast amount of successful experience in the financial services industry. He can't be bribed, as he is unequivocally the wealthiest person in the House of Commons, with a net worth, according to many newspaper reports, of £500 million. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what makes the City of London special. Right? Well, the best place to start is understand the main activity of the City of London. Yes, we are all aware that it's involved in the financial services industry. Well, now it's the services industry. But what exactly does that mean to the normal guy on the street? Well, basically speaking, how this applies uniquely to London is a startling reminder of just how fast things can move. Because without any exaggeration, there are few countries, let alone cities, anywhere in the world that, when it comes to commercial activity, comes even close to London. When it comes to big banks, when it comes to law firms and tech innovation within those industries, London is basically unmatched. Now, it's London, not Paris, not Cologne, not Dusseldorf, not Amsterdam, not Dublin, which has become the real hub of innovation. But this does not just apply to financial services industry. This applies to the services industry. And if you don't believe me, this has already been confirmed by the Global Research Identifier database. With almost 2,000 research institutions based in London, this underscores the position of the city as a global hub for innovation. But don't take my word for it, the biomedical sector, which is fast becoming one of the biggest growing services industry on the planet, has more than £1.5 billion investment in research to take it forward into the future. And London has the major presence in that activity. The funds for this research, well, they've come from the city. You see, they've come from a broad spectrum of economic sectors, all within the city, that further demonstrate a very simple message to the city. Success is inevitable. Or at least it was, because there are things changing. Where London's innovation scores bigger than any other city is how it fosters and actively promotes and cherishes her own community. You see, London is front and centre on the world stage, and London represents the who's who in international trade. Now, it achieved this by doing three things, really simply and extremely quickly. They automated the processes, they made it easier for people to part with their hard-earned money, and third, most importantly, they learned better than anybody how to leverage off automated processes in multiple ways across multiple spectrums. So let's take an example so we can understand it a little bit. Now, may I say to you, please leave your moral or nationalist judgments at the exit door. I say this because I know the second example is going to cause consternation amongst many of you, and I'll get lambasted from here to kingdom come. But anyway, I'll move on. The first one we'll look at before I get stoned is the IBAN system of coding. Now, though many of you will be aware of that term, what you are probably not aware of is who drove this system. okay, which has become the international norm for bank-to-bank transactions. Now, please, you might have thought that was quite simple, bank-to-bank transactions. Well, it wasn't so simple because there were specific formats for the transactions. So the identification of accounts and transaction types were left basically to one bank's agreement with another bank in another country or even in the same country. So it was individual agreements. It was a nightmare, and it had become disastrous because it was causing more problems than anybody could handle, particularly as globalization was forging ahead. Now, you see, London didn't develop they didn't invent it, it was invented in Europe. But London's influence took over because, you see, London is by far the biggest clearing banking system in Europe, and it is the jewel in the crown of the City of London. If it was to lose the clearing, it would have devastating effect. Now, given that position, London was able to insist that any system adopted suited their needs. And as the French would say, et voilà, it was London that dictated the conditions that especially suited them. So it was adopted by the European Committee Banking Standards, the ECBS, and then later as an international standard under ISO 13616, 1997. Now, London recognized and adapted faster than anybody else that complex financial innovations were being made feasible on a much larger scale without the need for that large, massive investment in computer hardware. The days of the IBM floors, floors covered in computers, not people, were gone, okay? These developments, together with the deregulation, created new competitors and new financial markets and was instrumental in the development for commercial banks as providers of financial services. Now, so if London copped this faster than anybody else, and so if you were not in London, you didn't matter. Now let's look at the second example, Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica legitimately gathered data on millions of Facebook users. They did the same as Facebook do every day, but they had developed extremely complex algorithms that identified voters in the American presidential election that were sitting on the fence. They did nothing more than nothing less. They only identified who were sitting on the fence. Then they took it a stage further because they were able to work with the marketing gurus on how best to target that audience. And what made them famous was, apart from getting caught, was A, Facebook had not managed to develop such complex analytics systems. Not themselves anyway. And instead they wanted Cambridge to develop it, after which Facebook would probably have adopted it and sold it as one of their services. And B, Cambridge gave a different reason for access to the Facebook data. Okay, but that business innovation element that is now in London's DNA came about just over the last 4 decades as world markets became more accessible through that better technology. None of this would have been possible without Thatcher's policies, I have to say, of deregulation and movement away from traditional industries that enabled London to grab the stuffy banking industry that prior to the 70s and 80s was the second oldest industry in the world. I'll leave you to guess what the oldest one is, okay? But London's banking industry exploded, but the innovation element that is now part and parcel of London's DNA only grew over the last 4 decades as the world markets became more accessible through the better technology. And London's service industry was at the forefront of all of that. Now, again, London, having taken advantage of the policies, were the first to insert that new technology into what was, prior to that, one of the most archaic industries, but more importantly, it was a massive sleeping giant. Now, so to Mr. Sunak's announcement and what exactly was agreed and what was in it for London, or what's in it, so we'll start with the announcement that the UK has, according to Rishi Sunak, agreed, and I'm quoting here, the financial partnership is a new agreement which will support increased financial services activities between the two countries. It even went on to say that the partnership will facilitate closer cooperation, greater information sharing, and opportunities to boost the trade and investment. Now that all sounds great, doesn't it? I mean, after all, how can signing a cooperation deal be bad? Well, the reality, however, explains why we haven't heard much from the city folks and even less from Singapore. And why? Well, the answer is very simple. Rishi Sunak lied. He lied through his teeth on camera in front of the British people. There is no question about it. He lied. You see, there has been no deal agreed. There are no conditions agreed. There's no appointments of negotiators, let alone regulators. The fact that after the document was signed, it was lauded by Rishi Sunak as a breakthrough, this is also worrying because he wasn't a breakthrough. But let's look at that later, okay? This document simply announced that it is the intention of both governments to work together in the future. Other leaders have signed MOUs like that. I seem to remember one in 1938 between the UK and Germany. But considering that many Singapore investment firms operate in London and many UK firms operate in Singapore, this move was hardly surprising, and one, quite frankly, could be forgiven for asking the question why it took so long, because it happened 18 months ago. Brexit happened 18 months ago. What have you been doing for the last 18 months? Now, the major stumbling block for this alliance is that both Singapore and London are fierce competitors. Singapore does not wish to serve the spoils of the fastest growing continent on their doorstep with a juggernaut full of competitors coming in from London. Now, we must also take account of a few things that's happened in the past, and that is the echoes of Singapore on the Thames. It still rings in the ears of this small but extremely aware and significant Southeast Asian country. To them, this phrase was almost a call to arms. It wasn't considered by Singaporeans as just UK nationalism. To them, it was a challenge to the much coveted services industry, around which, just like the UK is now, their economy is largely built. To provide an example of this point, one does not have to look further than our own leader of the House of Commons, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg. His company, Somerset Capital, which by the way has 50% of its assets and investments in China with Chinese companies, recently expanded their Singapore office. Now, this is only in the last few months to handle this business, okay? They didn't set up in Singapore and take on extra expenses of offices because they wanted to. They set up in Singapore because they had to. And Singapore knows this, and they are happy to accommodate this arrangement so long as the spoils, they remain in Singapore. Now, so ask yourself this. Being that Singapore is in part of the world that is the fastest growing economic region on the face of the planet, along with the expertise to execute trade effectively and within a very, very robust legal system, both in banking and in common law, in a country where the national language is English, could it be that Rishi may have jumped the gun a bit with his announcement of how great things are going to be? Well, I'm going to leave you with a one-liner that'll put what happened in the banking industry over the last 40 years into some perspective, so you'll get a sense of just how big it is. In 1973, Merrill Lynch had 300 employees. Today in London, it has 2,000 employees. 2,000 employees. So I'll leave it for you to decide. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again sometime soon. Bye.